Before kings wrote their names in history, anonymous hands were already shaping the destiny of the Holy Land. They were not heroes, they were not mentioned, but it was they, the invisible ones, who raised the stones, created the paths, and prepared the world where the Bible would be read for the first time. A calloused hand presses a stone into the surf. Another hand passes it along. Wave after wave, men lifting, setting, tamping. From a distance, the work looks like a single motion, a causeway, a road from shore to island. Up close, it is sweat, blood, hunger, and the rhythm of tools striking rock. That causeway would become the opening image of a new order across the Eastern Mediterranean. But the causeway itself, the stones, the ropes, the sailors who held the boat steady, the masons who shaped each block, is more than a military trick. It is the first visible sign of a deeper truth. The great transformations of the ancient Near East were often powered by hands that would never be named in the histories that followed. This is a story about those invisible workers and how their labor, physical and intellectual, helped to shape the world in which the Bible would be read, translated, copied, and carried across continents. It is not only the tale of the man with the crown who rode at the front. It is the tale of the men who carried the stones behind him, the sailors who kept his fleets, the scribes who bent over lamps to copy sacred texts, and the translators who recast those texts into a new tongue. Together, visible conquest and invisible toil produced a cultural and linguistic environment that would change the map of faith for centuries. The campaign that made the causeway famous was lightning fast by the standards of the era. In a few years, Alexander's Macedonian army swept from the Greek world into the Persian heartlands. Speed and shock mattered, but so did engineering, siege towers, battering rams, portable bridges, and the relentless human supply chain that fed and built them. The island city of Tyre resisted. Its city walls stood surrounded by water, and for months Alexander's army could not bring their siege engines close enough to do the job. The solution was brute, patient labor, a massive causeway built from wrecked ships and quarried stone, a procession of men ferrying material across the shallows while archers and machines covered them from the walls. Picture the scene. Men with chisels and sledgehammers break rock on the shoreline. Boats line up like bees around a hive. Ropes creak. A mason lifts a slab, his forearms veined with effort. A sailor steadies a boat with a naked foot. An officer shouts over the sound of waves and hammer. Fire ships are sent, counterswept, towers are rolled closer. Eventually, the walls are breached. What military histories record as an engineer's triumph is, when you look closely, a mosaic of human labor. The dock workers who towed barges, the carpenters who lashed planks, the prisoners and levied labor who carried the weight. There is a cost. Historical sources note that the fall of Tyre was followed by mass punishments, sentences meant to terrify other cities into submission. The accounts vary, and the numbers are debated. Ancient writers often emphasize spectacle in ways modern historians scrutinize. Yet even here, the brutal display itself depends on men who built the scaffolds, tended the fires, and disposed of bodies. Conquest is dramatic, certainly, but its theatrical power is sustained by invisible infrastructure and the people who maintained it. What happened on that causeway would play out in smaller, more clandestine ways across the coast. At Gaza, engineers dug tunnels, built ramps, and hammered at walls. Mines were dug beneath fortifications to undermine them. Ramps were packed with earth to bring siege engines forward. In one well-known episode, the commander of Gaza refused to yield, and the assault left the city devastated. Alexander himself was wounded in the fighting, an injury that underscores how closely the commander shared the hazards of siegecraft. The fall of Gaza made clear a pattern. When a city resisted, the visible price could be high. But the hidden human machinery, the miners, the pitters, the rope teams, determined how high that price would be. These episodes of siegecraft are not just military anecdotes. They are metaphors for the larger mechanics of historical change. The visible flash of victory rests on a foundation of repetitive, often anonymous labor. And that foundation would be repurposed by institutions whose influence stretched far beyond military conquest. Alexander's campaigns dismantled one imperial map and created openings for new administrative practices and ways of life. He founded cities, Alexandria in Egypt being the most consequential for our story, that functioned as magnets for commerce, governance, and culture. But the decision to found a city is political. The consequences are practical. Officials, clerks, and local leaders had to be appointed. Markets needed regulation. Religious leaders and local elites had to be negotiated with or neutralized. In Jerusalem, for example, the encounter between Macedonian power and Jewish religious leadership was not only a battlefield incident, it was an administrative calculation. According to the sources we have, representatives of Jerusalem, including the high priest, often called Jaddua in later accounts, met with Alexander. The scene, as recorded in some traditions, is striking. A procession of priests in full vestments approaching an army that could have leveled cities.
Whether every detail of the meeting is historically precise is debated among historians, but the broad outcome is clear in several accounts. Alexander recognized a degree of religious autonomy for Jewish worship and, by some reports, granted privileges and honors to the priesthood. That accommodation mattered. By protecting local religious institutions and their leaders, conquerors like Alexander helped to preserve the social scaffolding that maintains sacred texts, rituals, and memories. Those protections created the conditions in which scribes and temple personnel could continue copying and safeguarding scriptures. Again, the story shifts from the generals to the stewards, the priests, the temple clerks, the temple artisans who maintained scrolls and ritual objects. Their labor was less conspicuous than the construction of a ramp, but it was no less essential. A single guarantee of privilege could mean that a library survived, that scrolls were copied, that a legal tradition continued within its community. Historians differ on how extensive such privileges were and how often they were upheld, but the pattern is important. Military conquest often coexisted with administrative continuity, and this continuity frequently rested on the work of officials and cultic personnel who cared for texts. From the ruins of battlefield and agora emerges Alexandria, a city meant to embody Greek culture across the Near East. The city's founding seems at first like the triumph of a conqueror's vision, but the durable power of Alexandria lay in routine things. Docks where grain was unloaded, warehouses where merchants counted coins, and scribal workshops where texts were copied. It is here that invisible intellectual labor takes center stage. Imagine a dim room warmed by oil lamps. A scribe sits hunched over a long, narrow table, a piece of parchment rolled out before him. His fingers are stained with ink. He holds a reed pen, trims its nib with a small knife, and begins the careful process of copying a text line by line. This image is not an invention divorced from evidence. Archaeologists and papyrologists have recovered fragments and tools that confirm the conditions under which text circulated. Copying is slow work. Mistakes must be corrected. Marginal notes accumulate. The materials themselves, animal skins for parchment, papyrus sheets, carbon black ink, require regular procurement and maintenance. Each copy is a small industry, and each industry is staffed by hands that rarely make it into the biographies of kings. The translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek, often grouped under the name the Septuagint, is emblematic of how invisible intellectual labor reshaped religious life. The process of rendering Hebrew into Greek was not a single moment, but a series of translations and revisions over time. It arose in a multilingual world where many Jewish communities no longer spoke Hebrew as a living tongue, but did speak Greek. Translators, men, and perhaps some women, who knew both languages, worked to make sacred texts intelligible in the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. They were scholars, interpreters, and craftsmen with pens. Their choices, How to translate a word, whether to interpret an idiom, how to order a passage, would have long-term theological and liturgical consequences. It is important to treat these translations as human acts. The Septuagint, for example, is not a single divinely authored document, but a compilation of versions shaped by human judgment and context. Scholars debate the dates, the motivations, and the processes behind these translations. Some texts were likely translated in Alexandria by Jewish scholars connected to newly formed synagogues. Others were adapted later. The outcome, however, is undeniable. Greek translations made Jewish scriptures legible in a world where Greek was the common language. That legibility matters because it opened a path for texts to cross cultural boundaries and to be read in contexts that the original Hebrew might not have reached on its own. The library traditions of Alexandria amplified this effect. Libraries and royal collections did not merely hoard scrolls, they organized, cataloged, and preserved. Librarians, whose names rarely survive, developed systems to copy and conserve texts, to collate variants, and to house works under the patronage of powerful institutions. Their work was not neutral. Selection, commentary, and the very architecture of a library shape what is remembered. The survival of certain texts over others is as much a story of institutional choice as it is a story of divine providence or fate. We can dramatize one such moment to make it concrete, but this should be understood as a reconstruction, a dramatization. Picture translators seated around a table inscribed with small oil lamps, each voice attempting to balance literal fidelity and intelligibility. Passages that in Hebrew are compact and elusive must be rendered into Greek that reaches a broader audience. Debates would arise. Do we translate a sacred name directly, or do we use a Greek concept that approximates the meaning? The decisions feel technical, but their effects ripple outward. The Greek renderings will later be the text read by Hellenistic Jews, by Greek-speaking synagogues, and by early Christians composed in Greek. Every choice made by those translators becomes an unseen vector in the future of textual interpretation. This intellectual labor produced practical consequences for the early Christian movement. New Testament writers composed primarily in Greek. The letters of Paul, the Gospels written for Greek-speaking communities, and the broader circulation of Christian texts all took place in a linguistic ecosystem that had been shaped by decades of translation and administration. Paul's travels intersect with ports, marketplaces, and cities where Greek served as the bridge language. When he preaches in Athens or writes to the community in Corinth, he is entering a world made legible by earlier work that included the quiet, repeatable gestures of scribes and translators. Yet, it would be a mistake to frame this as a story of inevitable progress. The spread of Greek and Hellenistic institutions carried both opportunity and loss. Local traditions were sometimes marginalized. Cultural identities were negotiated in new terms. The political decisions that spared certain religious practices also aligned these practices within imperial structures that exerted pressure and control. The same administrative continuity that allowed temple scribes to keep copying scrolls also placed religious life within a framework that answered to broader civic norms. The moral and spiritual outcomes were ambiguous. Continuity in one register could mean assimilation in another. All of this returns us to the idea of visible versus invisible. Empires make monuments. Kings build cities, sign decrees, and appear on coins. Those images dominate chronicles and popular memory. But lasting cultural change, the kind that alters liturgy, language, textual transmission, and religious self-understanding, is as often the product of patient, repetitive work. Masons shaping stones, sailors maintaining trade routes, scribes copying manuscripts, and librarians curating collections. The imprint of such labor can be more durable than the footprint of an army. Consider the line between a stone and a book. A causeway of stones enabled conquest, but that conquest created administrative censors where official languages shifted. A shift in the official language created demand for translations. The translations required scribes and readers. The books these workers produced traveled on the same roads, through the same ports, and alongside the same merchants that sustained empires. In this way, a bridge of stone helped to carry a book. We can trace the consequences into the early centuries of Christian expansion. As communities formed across Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Mediterranean islands, their scriptures and liturgies circulated in Greek. Churches read Greek versions of the Hebrew texts alongside Christian writings in the same tongue. Missionaries like Paul could address audiences that shared a rhetorical and literary framework shaped by Hellenistic education. The New Testament as we have it, largely composed in Greek and transmitted through Greek-speaking contexts, is not simply a product of theological revelation alone. It is also a product of historical languages and institutions that were themselves built by countless invisible hands. This is not to reduce sacred texts to mere byproducts of imperial mechanics. Religious conviction, spiritual inspiration, and community dynamics played their own roles. But the argument here is structural. If the cultural and linguistic scaffolding had been different, the pathways of dissemination, interpretation, and authority for the Bible would have been different as well. The presence of Greek as a common language, the existence of copying workshops and libraries, the protection of local cultic authorities, all these were prerequisites for the form in which biblical texts were circulated and read in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. There are debates, and responsible history must acknowledge them. Some biblical passages are interpreted by believers and scholars as prophetic or as evidence of foreknowledge. A classic example people often invoke is the Book of Daniel. Scholars do not agree on every point. Some read certain passages as prophecy, others see them as compositions reflecting historical concerns of the period in which they were written. Historians and textual critics argue about dates, layers of editing, and political contexts. These debates do not undermine the spiritual significance these texts hold for communities. They do, however, remind us to be careful when linking historical events and literary claims too neatly. A balanced narrative recognizes both the religious readings and the historical complexities. It is also worth reiterating that the material facts, numbers of people, casualties, the exact sequence of events, are often contested in the sources. Ancient writers had motives and limitations. Their accounts sometimes amplify, sometimes compress. Modern archaeology and philology help us correct and nuance those accounts, but they rarely turn noise into unambiguous certainty. Where historians disagree, phrases like sources vary and historians debate mark the appropriate humility of the historical method. Returning to our central claim, the climax of the argument comes into view when we see how the mundane and the monumental intersect. Cities were won by armies, yes, but they were governed, rebuilt, and turned into nodes of communication by administrators, artisans, and intellectual laborers. Libraries preserved texts, scribes reproduced them, translators made them intelligible across languages, merchants and sailors carried them along trade routes. The Bible, its texts, its commentaries, its liturgies, passed through these hands. The visible sweep of conquest created opportunities, but the invisible workers filled those opportunities with durable cultural forms. In the end, the persistence of a religious tradition often depends more on copying than on conquest. A single faithful scribe recopying a scroll for a temple archive, a translator choosing a Greek word to render a Hebrew phrase, a librarian protecting a codex from damp and vermin. These are the small, repetitive acts that over generations shape what communities remember and how they read their sacred stories. There is a final image to hold: a stone, a pen, and a bridge. The stone made the path for an army. The bridge connected cities and people. The pen preserved the words those people would read when they sought meaning. None of these acts alone explains the trajectory of faith and scripture. Together, however, they form a chain of causality that links human hands to the religious maps we inherit. If this exploration has sparked your curiosity, there are companion episodes that dive deeper into particular moments. For instance, a focused study of the Babylonian exile and its aftermath, or a detailed reconstruction of the siege of Tyre.
Check the playlist linked below to continue the series. As the film closes, imagine the camera pulling back from the close-up of a scribe's ink-stained fingers to an aerial view of a coastline dotted with ancient ruins and modern settlements. The monuments stand as memorials to conquest. The library fragments and palimpsests are quieter monuments to labor. The Holy Land, and the Bible as it came to be known across the Mediterranean, is the outcome of both spectacle and persistence. The kings and their battles set the stage. The hands that carried the stones, wrote the words, and tended the archives filled it with durable meaning. In the story of Scripture's formation, the unnamed are not incidental. The masons who broke the rock, the sailors who guided the ships, the miners who undermined walls, the priests who safeguarded scrolls, the scribes who copied line after line by the light of an oil lamp, and the translators who found words in a new language. These are the people whose labor shaped the context in which sacred texts were preserved and read. Their work underwrote a linguistic and institutional world that allowed the Bible to be shared across cultures and centuries. History is often told through the lives of the great and are visible, but the durability of ideas is owed as much to the repetitive, patient, and sometimes unseen practices of everyday labor. When you next read a passage from a scripture translated into your language, remember that behind it are hands that built, carried, and wrote, invisible workers whose toil became the medium for religious memory. If you want to dive deeper into how empires and labor shaped scripture across time, subscribe to the series and explore the playlist for the full study.